Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Friday, March 15th slate of college basketball DFS. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a big, deep dive, detailed look at the early slate because as I'm recording this at about 10 p.m. Eastern Time Thursday night, we have the early slate, we have the salaries, and we know what 7 games are going to be a part of it. The late slate is still kind of TBD because a lot of the matchups are going to be determined after the results of these games. So what I plan on doing is recording for the early slate, getting everything out for the early slate. And then at the end, I'm going to kind of, check and see where the night slate is in terms of knowing the matchups and knowing the salaries and all that. And I'm going to kind of give what I have for the night slate at the time of recording. I'm not going to stay up till 1 a.m. just to wait on the night slate. And who knows, they might not even have salaries out by 1 a.m. anyway. So, hopefully, we can give you guys all the information you need here on both slates here on this episode. And also, if you do want more thoughts on the night slate, I'm probably not going to be able to go in as much detail as I do for the early slate. So if you do want more thoughts on the night slate, make sure you join the Fantasy Corner Discord. The link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. We've got a lot of smart people in there, play a lot of DFS for a lot of different sports, and college basketball is one of them. The college basketball chat in there is always jumping. And quite frankly, it's entirely free, and you do not get resources like that one in anywhere else for free. Like there's a ton of smart people to bounce ideas off of, talk strategy, talk plays, and then just enjoy sweating out together. It's a great community, and I could not recommend it enough. And then also, I will be writing a full article for every college basketball DFS slate to my Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. So if you want to know who actually makes my lineups as well as my strategies and attacks for the slate, that is where you can be getting that as well. So even if you want more from the night slate, those are the two places you can get more from the night slate from me. Now, one more thing, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. In fact, make sure you like this video on YouTube and rate and review on the audio. It really does help me out a ton. I really do appreciate it. It shows me a ton of support when you guys do that. It really helps me out, and I cannot stress enough how helpful it is. But make sure you're subscribed because the plan is, as of right now, to go live tomorrow night to talk about the Saturday slate. And then the plan is to go live Saturday night to talk about the Sunday slate. And then we're going to go live Sunday night after the bracket is revealed to do a quick kind of bracket breakdown. And then the full bracket breakdown show with a guest is going to be Monday, just like it was last year. So if you're subscribed to the channel, subscribed to the audio feed, you're going to get episodes for Saturday, Sunday, the quick bracket breakdown, the instant bracket breakdown, and then the full bracket breakdown on Monday as well. So because we've got a ton of content coming your way, because we're also going to do full DFS previews for all 16 Thursday games and all 16 Friday games once that bracket is out. So this is the time of year where you're going to want to be subscribed. You're going to want to be tuning into this because hopefully I'm going to be giving you guys plenty of information that is going to help you win some money playing college basketball DFS. All right, so that kind of does it for the introduction, guys. Let's go ahead and dive into game number one. So this is a super interesting early slate in terms of the game environments that you're going to be targeting. Among the 7 games, the highest total is 149, and there is no team that is projected to score more than 78 points according to KenPom. So with it being a lot of low totals and there really no obvious game stacking options, it's going to be really interesting to see just how you can construct your lineup of, are there games that you're going to cross out? Are there games that you are going to stack? I think for once, game stacking might be a little bit of a contrarian build because there just is no obvious game that stands out to stack. So I think that's going to be super interesting when it comes to building lineups. But anytime he is on the slate, we got to talk about this first guy, and that is Zach Edey of Purdue. So the first game of the slate is going to be between Michigan State and Purdue. It is projected to be 75-69 in favor of Purdue for 144-point total. In the previous matchup between these two teams this season, Purdue won that game 80-74. Now, Michigan State is coming off of a big game from A.J. Hoggard in their first game in the Big Ten tournament against Minnesota. He was 6 for 6 from the field and put up 31 fantasy points. The big news there is that he only needed 6 shots to put up 31 fantasy points. That's pretty darn impressive if you ask me. And so Hoggard is a guy that, he's played in postseasons before. He's a dependable player. He's an experienced guard. I definitely think he's a guy who you could see his usage go up a little bit as postseason play continues for the Spartans. But what's also interesting is that Tyson Walker also had a decent game as well. He did lead them in usage and in shots, put up 28 fantasy points on 15 shots. We've talked about Tyson Walker throughout the season. He's a guy who takes a ton of shots, and he's simply got to be in your player pool because of the upside that he has from all the shots that he takes. In the first game against Purdue, he was okay. He put up 29 fantasy points on 15 shots. It's not bad. It's not great either. Malik Hall today against Minnesota dealt with foul trouble. Only played 21 minutes, only put up 10 fantasy points. That's not what you're accustomed to for him, but he does have an incredibly high ceiling. And in that first game against Purdue, he was not great either, only putting up 24 fantasy points. So to me, Walker and Hall are kind of the ceiling plays. Hogard is a little more of a cash game type play. Now, what's also really interesting is today, in Malik Hall dealing with that foul trouble, the freshman Xavier Booker had a really solid performance, played 15 minutes, put up 15 fantasy points, playing a lot of that at the 4 spot in relief of Malik Hall, which honestly, in terms of the X's and O's, I think he's more of a 4 than a 5 from what I've seen of him this season. So I think that that was a very good fit for him in a very profitable situation for him, that he was able to put up 1 fantasy point per minute. And against Purdue earlier in the season, he played 12 minutes and put up 14 fantasy points. That's not terrible for a guy who's $3,900. But also what's really interesting is they are now pretty much, Matty Sissoko is out of the rotation for Michigan State almost. He did not play very much today at all. Carson Cooper and Jackson Kohler split minutes at the 5. Cooper started and played 21 minutes. He also played 16 minutes the last time against Purdue. But Kohler is the guy I'm more interested in from a fantasy perspective. He played 20 minutes today and put up 16 fantasy points just because he's a guy that they will really feed it to him in the low block, and he does have a high usage rate when he's out there. In the previous game against Purdue, Kohler did play 11 minutes and put up 4 fantasy points, put up 3 fouls in those 11 minutes, probably because he was guarding Zach Edey. Speaking of Zach Edey, he is the highest priced player on the slate, which he pretty much is any slate that he's on. And he was really good, like even good for Zach Edey standards against Michigan State earlier in the season. He put up 56 fantasy points on 9 for 15 shooting, which is it's really good. Like 56 fantasy points, that is over 5x value. And we've talked about how Zach Edey often isn't on GPP winning lineups because it is very rare where he goes for 5x and 6x value. This is the type of situation where he could in fact do that because he just showed it that he could go 5x against this team. So I definitely do think that Zach Edey is more in play for me than on other slates, simply because of what he did against Michigan State previously. And I think he's a really, really solid cash game option because of the floor that he provides from his usage. Now, Braden Smith was also great in that first game against Michigan State. He put up 41 fantasy points on 8 for 11 shooting. That's a really efficient shooting night for Braden Smith. So I don't know if we can necessarily count on that again, but the usage was there. He did have a 18% usage rate, which was the second on the team, which is generally where he's been all season long, is second on the team behind Zach Edey. So I don't think Braden Smith makes for a bad play either. I think he would also make for a pretty solid contrarian play if you wanted to fade Edey and play Braden Smith. Now, we've talked about the Ediettes, we can call them, that's the supporting cast for this Purdue team all season long, how they are a ceiling game waiting to happen, but you never really know who it's going to come from or when it's going to come. Well, in that last game against Michigan State, it was Fletcher Lawyer who had the big game. He was 5 for 9 from the field, put up 24 fantasy points in 31 minutes, and that was kind of the start of something for him. Since that game, that was the first game in this streak, he's had 3 games at 24 fantasy points or more. He's only coming in at a salary of $5,300. I think he is a guy that has a ton of upside, and I think he's going to be probably a pretty popular value play here on this Friday slate. Game number 2 is going to be Mississippi State taking on Tennessee. KenPom has this one projected to be 75-68 in favor of Tennessee for a 143-point total. The previous time these two teams played, Mississippi State won 77-72. Now, what's really interesting about that game is Mississippi State's 2 best players both came off the bench in that game, in Toulouse Smith and Josh Hubbard. Josh Hubbard was the guy offensively for them in that game. He had 25 real points on 26% usage. However, the problem is with Josh Hubbard is there are games where he often doesn't do a whole lot outside of score. And this was one of them. So even though he had 25 real points, he only had 29 fantasy points. But now he's back in the starting lineup. He's playing more and more minutes. He's taken a ton of shots. He's put up 30 fantasy points in 6 straight games. I definitely think there's a pretty solid case to be made for playing Josh Hubbard here in this slate. Even though we know Tennessee is a great, elite level defensive team, if you have enough shots at the basket, you're going to make some of them no matter how good the defense is. Now, Toulouse Smith did have 23 real points in that game, but he only had 4 rebounds, which was a little bit of a disappointment for him. So he only put up 30 fantasy points in that game, which is still 4x value for a guy at his salary. I think he's another guy that, with his usage, with his shots and playing a ton of minutes now, he's got a lot of upside like Josh Hubbard, and I think you can make the case for both of them, even going against this Tennessee defense. However, I probably would not play two of them together. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the move. What I do think you can do though is play one of the supporting cast. They're going really starting five heavy now. Mississippi State is, with Cameron Matthews, DJ Jeffries, and Deshaun Davis being the rest of the starting five. Cameron Matthews is a guy that I very rarely play just because he puts up a lot of fantasy points on not a whole lot of usage, and it's a very narrow pathway to fantasy scoring. But DJ Jeffries, ever since he's started this little streak of playing 30 minutes or more, he's put up 24 fantasy points or more in those 3 games. I think he's a really solid value option. Deshaun Davis is the same way. He's played 28 minutes or more in 3 straight games and put up 20 fantasy points or more in 3 straight games. So both of those guys, I think, make for really compelling value plays here on this slate. Now on the Tennessee side, Dalton Connect is their offense, right? Like we've talked about this time and time again, how he is their best offensive player. They will rely on him to bail them out offensively a lot. And that was kind of the case in the first meeting against Mississippi State. He had 28 points, had 44 fantasy points on a 42% usage rate. That's just absurd numbers. And even though Mississippi State plays at a pretty slow tempo, they're a pretty good defensive team. Dalton Connect's another one of these guys that he's going to get so many shots at the basket that he's going to have a lot of chances to put up fantasy points. Zakai Ziegler usually doesn't put up a whole lot of fantasy points via scoring, but he did against Mississippi State. He put up 47 fantasy points in that game. He had 26 real points, had a 27% usage rate. And with Zakai Ziegler, as they usually are, the peripheral stats were on point. So I think he's another guy you could get into your lineups. We've talked about this with Tennessee, though. They generally, when Connect has his big games, no one else generally really gets there. When Ziegler has his big games, because of how much he does with assisting and the other stuff, somebody else usually does get there. So if I'm going to play somebody from Tennessee, which I do think you can cross this game off altogether, I don't think that that's out of the question either. But if I'm going to play somebody from Tennessee, it's either going to be just Connect, or it's going to be like a Ziegler and Adu, or a Ziegler and James, or a Ziegler and Vescovi combo. Now, speaking of the rest of those guys, Jonas Adu dealt with foul trouble in the first game, and it was just not great. And then Josiah Jordan-James and Santiago Vescovi, they did not record a whole lot of fantasy points just because so much of the usage was lumped up around Connect and Ziegler, about 70% usage to be exact. So definitely like a situation where I'm playing Connect or I'm playing like a pair of the other guys. Next up, we have ECU taking on UCF in the quarterfinals of the American Athletic Tournament. And KenPom has this one projected to be USF 73-66. The last time these two teams played, USF won 71-60. So KenPom has this game projected for 139-point total, whereas the previous game had a 131-point total. And we don't see ECU on main slates very often. They're a team that they rank 311th in the nation in tempo, so that's not exactly fantasy point goodness. However, they give up a ton of 3-pointers, they give up a ton of offensive rebounds, and they give up a ton of assists. So while there may not be a total number of possessions that's super high in this game, they're going to give up a lot of fantasy points per possession because of how they give up their baskets, right? Now, offensively for ECU, RJ Felton is their best player. Like, I have watched this team play Charlotte twice. Charlotte is my alma mater. And he's a really good offensive guard, and he can get some peripheral stats with rebounds and assists as well. So to me, he's the guy that has the most ceiling. If they're going to keep this game close, it's going to be because of him. In the previous meeting against USF, he took a ton of shots. He took 17, but only put up 28 fantasy points. So if he's able to be a little more efficient from the floor, he's definitely a guy who has like legitimate 5x upside at $8,000. Now, he also has like the peripheral stats are not bad, right? He has a combined 20% rebounding rate. And so if this game does get going up and down, that's going to give him more opportunities for rebounds, which we do like for fantasy scoring. And in that first game against South Florida, I mentioned that he had 17 shots. Well, it was a 33% usage rate, which is it's really good. So RJ Felton, definitely, in my opinion, the alpha on this ECU offense. Now, the guy who is actually their usage leader on the season, though, is Ezra Asar, but he doesn't generally play a ton of minutes, right? And that's why you see his fantasy point totals fluctuate so much during the season. But it's conference tournament time, y'all, and we talked about this with the Wednesday slate. Or was it? Yeah, the Wednesday slate. Guys who are actually their team's best player are going to play more minutes because it's win or go home. There's no tomorrow, right? And so you're going to go out with your best players on the floor. And I definitely think Ezra Asar fits that criteria for ECU. Against Tulsa in the first round of the AAC tournament, he played 33 minutes, was 10 for 12 from the floor, put up 49 fantasy points. So I think he is a guy who has a ton of upside. If he's going to play 30 minutes again like he did in that game against Tulsa, he's a great option at DFS. Brandon Johnson is a guy that is actually their price leader. But to me, he's kind of in like the Cameron Matthews club, like we talked about from Mississippi State, but he's a better version of that. Like he puts up a ton of fantasy points, but it's a very narrow pathway because he doesn't do it with a ton of shots. He's kind of reliant on getting a lot of rebounds and putting up some peripheral stats as well. I would rather play RJ Felton than Brandon Johnson, if I'm being honest. Now, what's also interesting for this team is with the host of other players that they play, like Sear Malonga starts but doesn't really do a whole lot. Jaden Walker, Bobby Pettiford, and Cam Hayes and Quentin Bunje are going to rotate at the other guard spot. But Cam Hayes has really become the leader at the off guard spot, playing more recently than the other guys. In their last 2 games, he's played 19 minutes or more, put up 19 fantasy points or more. I don't think he's a bad option. I think he's pretty darn talented. He was previously an NC State transfer and an LSU transfer. So he's a guy who does, I think, have a little bit of upside at 4,800. Apples to apples, I'd rather play Ezra Asar at the same price, but Cam Hayes is definitely a sneaky value play if he's actually going to take over and be this team's second guard. Now, on the South Florida side, they're pretty interesting. We've talked about them before, but they have a big 3 in terms of usage, and it's Selton Miguel, Kayshawn Pryor, and Chris Youngblood. Miguel comes off the bench, so he's a little more volatile from his fantasy scoring. He's also a little more shot dependent than the other guys. Kayshawn Pryor is their starting center, but he does not move like a center. This guy is a great athlete. I think he's going to be a mismatch for the ECU bigs. The last time they played, he put up 37 fantasy points, and I think that's just evidence of that statement. And then Chris Youngblood is a guy who he's just good at basketball. He does a lot statistically. He's generally pretty efficient from the floor as well. First game against ECU, he put up 31 fantasy points, and he's only $6,000 because he had a dud last game against Tulsa. So I definitely do like all 3 of those big 3 for South Florida. If I were to play a South Florida value play, though, Corey Walker Jr. is a little bit interesting because if they start getting destroyed on the boards or if Kayshawn Pryor gets in foul trouble, he goes in pretty much just specifically to rebound. But I like Brandon Stroud. He's an off-ball guard who is a really good rebounder. He's actually their best offensive rebounder. And we mentioned how ECU gives up a ton of offensive rebounds. Well, he actually had 4 offensive rebounds in the first game against ECU on his way to putting up 28 fantasy points in that game. So I think he's a really solid option as a value play as well at $5,400. All right, so let's take a quick little breather and then let's talk about the last 4 games. All right, next game up is going to be between Wisconsin and Northwestern, the second quarterfinal in the Big Ten tournament. KenPom has this one projected to be 72-69 in favor of Wisconsin for a 141-point total. The previous meeting between these 2 teams was 71-63 in favor of Wisconsin. Both these teams that were kind of amoebas when it comes to tempo. Amoeba. I think it's amoeba. They are amoebas when it comes to tempo. They will play at the pace that the other team allows them to play. So in the first game, they played really slow. And it would not shock me to see that again because both of these teams are kind of like banged up, especially on the Northwestern side. Now, for Wisconsin, I don't really think you can go by much of the stats from the Maryland game. That game was an utter blowout where they got the starters out as quickly as possible to conserve legs for potentially having to play 4 games in 4 days at this Big Ten tournament. So I don't really think you can look too much into that. But they are who they are, right? What we know about them. Tyler Wall and Stephen Crow are solid front court that have a ton of upside, but you never really know when they're going to have their ceiling games. Northwestern is really banged up in the front court, so Wall and Crow could be able to take advantage of that. Hepburn is their assisting guard who is more of a distributor than anything else. And he was very, let's say, running hot in terms of his assists and his scoring, and he's kind of cooled off just a little bit. I think he's at a more reasonable price tag than he was about a week ago, but I'm probably not going to him as any kind of core option or anything. AJ Storr is Mr. Scorer for them. Like that's all he does is score. But he's only 5,800 now. And, you don't have to do a whole lot else at 5,800 to hit value. In the first game against Northwestern, he had 14 and 5 on 11 shots, which is below his average, and put up 23 fantasy points. So I do not think he is a bad option at all. He's going to get the shots. And if he can just do a little bit in terms of the peripheral stats, then he can definitely get you there at 5,800. Max Klesmit, believe it or not, is the guy who led them in scoring against Northwestern, the first time these two teams played, he had 24 points, 31 fantasy points. I don't necessarily think that's likely again, though, because John Blackwell has emerged as a star in the most three recent games for this Wisconsin team. He's put up 31, 25, and 26 fantasy points in his last three. I don't necessarily know if that's going to continue or not, but he certainly passes the eye test. He certainly looks better than Max Klesmit to me, and he looks like he has the chance to definitely overtake some minutes. So I would probably have John Blackwell in consideration because of that upside, but I don't know if there's I don't know if I necessarily feel super comfortable chasing the game log there. Now, on the Northwestern side, we mentioned them being almost out of players. Well, they're down center Matthew Nicholson and wing Ty Berry. And so what that has contributed is now they pretty much have four guys who are playing almost all 40 minutes and one like rotating fifth spot. And so in their most recent game, everything went through Bowie and Barnheiser. Both of those two guys scored 23 points. Barnheiser was the leader in usage, put up 43 fantasy points. Both of these guys have legitimate 5x upside. I think you can play them together because Barnheiser is a little bit more of a rebounder. Bowie is a little bit more of an assist guy, and they can both score it at a pretty decent clip. So I definitely don't mind getting to either of those two guys. Martinelli and Langborg were supporting players at the start of the season, but are now thrust into big roles where they're playing almost 40 minutes because they're just out of bodies. And so I definitely don't mind getting to either of them just because you know they're going to be on the court. You know they have upside for that reason. Blake Preston is the guy that I do want to mention, though. So he is the guy that is now playing the most minutes at the 5 spot with Matthew Nicholson out of the lineup. Played 25 minutes against Minnesota and put up 20 fantasy points. Look, at a salary of $4,000, that's outstanding. That's 5x value. So I definitely wouldn't mind getting to Blake Preston at all. To me, it doesn't really feel like chasing because, like, who else are they going to play? Nick Martinelli isn't really a 5. They tried giving Luke Hunger the big role, and he just didn't really do much with it. So I definitely think that Blake Preston is a guy who is going to be making my player pool as a value play. Next up, we have Wichita taking on UAB. KenPom has this one projected to be 75 to 73 in favor of UAB. This is the second highest game total on the slate. The previous time these two teams played, Wichita pulled an upset and won 74 to 66. Wichita's been playing some good ball recently, and I think it's because they finally figured out who they are, and they're one of these teams that in conference tournament play, if they condense the rotation, there's going to be some guys who have a ton of upside because they've been playing a huge rotation all season long. So if they condense it, the guys who are actually getting the minutes are going to be, quite frankly, misprices for where they're at. Colby Rogers was outstanding in the first meeting against UAB. He had 29 real points en route to 40 fantasy points. That's really good for a guy who's 7,300. He does have that legitimate upside. He's had 35 fantasy points or more in 4 of the last 5 games. A ton of upside for Colby Rogers. And Harlan Beverly's kind of the same way, right? Like he had 48 fantasy points against Memphis, 40 against Rice earlier in the month. And in the previous meeting against UAB, he had 28 fantasy points without really doing a whole lot in terms of scoring because this guy can really stuff the stat sheet. Rogers and Beverly are definitely both going to make my player pool. Now, also, what's interesting from there, though, is you're starting to see minutes condense a little bit. Like they played Memphis in the conference tournament today, and Quincy Ballard played 29 minutes, which is the most he has played in conference play this season. Yeah, since December 21st, it's the most minutes he's played. And what has been happening with this Wichita front court is Poto and Ballard have been splitting minutes almost 50-50 at the center position, which has been canceling each other's upside. And so if Ballard is going to play 29, 30 minutes, he's got a ton of upside at his salary of $5,400. Now, also another guy that got a lot of minutes today was Bijan Cortez. So I have been pretty critical of Bijan Cortez. Look, I do not try to really be super critical of college kids because I remember when I was in college at Charlotte and it's like, hey, that guy's in my algebra class and he's out here on the court tonight. Like these guys have a lot going on in their lives and that we're asking them as 18, 22-year-old kids to go out there and put a lot of pressure on them in a basketball game. Like I don't really get behind that. So, it's a crazy sport that we bet on, honestly, because you're literally playing guys who are coming from taking an econ final right to the court. And it's just, that's why I try not to be super critical of them is they are still kids. So anyway, I've been kind of critical of Bijan Cortez. Well, he started playing more minutes recently because he's been playing better. And against Rice, he played 22 minutes, put up 21 fantasy points. Against Memphis, played 31 minutes, put up 28 fantasy points. He's going to continue to play that many minutes. He's going to be a really solid fantasy option. He is a really good assister of the basketball. He's not an elite scorer, but he's good enough that you leave him open, he can knock down a three. And if you really bank on him passing the ball, he's smart enough to take it to the cup. So I definitely think he's a pretty solid option at 4,400. Again, I don't think it's chasing. I think it's this team actually condensing their rotations around who Paul Mills thinks is their best players. And if Bijan Cortez is one of those guys, then Bijan Cortez is the guy that needs to be in your lineups. Next up, we have UAB. And this is an interesting team because they are starting to get very top heavy in terms of their usage. I don't mind it. Yaxel Lendeborg is the second highest priced player on the slate behind only Zach Edey, but for good reason. He's had 3 games over 50 fantasy points in his last 5, which is incredible upside. And he's just an elite rebounder. Right? Against Wichita, he had 20 and 15 for 46 fantasy points. I think he's a pretty good option. Like I really think if you're not going to play Zach Edey, I think he's a pretty solid play. And I'm hoping that because I'm going to have some Landeborg lineups tomorrow. I'm hoping that a lot of people go Edey, so that way the ownership on Landeborg is a little bit lower, and you can get him at a little bit of a lower ownership cost than what Edey's at. Next, Vasquez is another guy who had a massive game against Wichita the previous time, 30 fantasy points on 7 for 17 shooting. He's a guy who has a supremely high usage rate. He had been coming off the bench, but in the last 4 games, he's played 31, 22, 27, and 35 minutes. So if the minutes are here to stay at the same usage rate he's been at, Alejandro Vasquez is a really good play at 5,500. And then Eric Gaines is their other guy who is the leader in usage. He's been really good over his last 3 games, 37, 41, and 45 fantasy points, but he laid a dud against Wichita. There's no way around it. He was 0 for 5, only put up 11 fantasy points, but the usage is there, and I really think that with this UAB team, those are you need to be your main considerations is Lindeborg, Gaines, and Vasquez. Do I think that you can play all 3 of them together? No. Do I think that 2 of them makes for a really solid game stacking option? Yes, absolutely. Now, Javian Davis is a guy who his minutes have been kind of trending downward recently, and it's because Christian Coleman's have been trending upward. Last 2 games, Christian Coleman has put up 30 or more fantasy points. This one feels a little more like game log chasing to me, but I mean, he's a guy who has a really good rebounding rate. Wichita is not a great rebounding team. And if he's going to play 20-plus minutes, he's shown that he has that upside. Another thing while I'm at it, I mentioned that I don't really criticize college kids a whole lot. I don't really like telling people that DFS plays are dumb or bad or advising you how to spend your money per se, because we play a crazy sport, right? Like this is a crazy game. It's very unpredictable. Guys that I think are personally bad plays are going to end up going off. Guys that I think are great plays are not. And, so I very rarely will like if you ask me, be like, hey, what do you think about this guy? I'll very rarely tell you like he's a terrible play, don't play him. I can give you stats to back up my opinion either way. But if you see something on a guy that sells you, I'm very rarely one to down it, because I think every slate there's 3 or 4 guys that are out of my player pool that go off. That's just the nature of the beast. We play an unpredictable sport. So I don't think Christian Coleman is a bad play, but to me, he does feel a little bit like chasing the game logs. Next up, we have South Carolina taking on Auburn. And so this one, KenPom has projected to be 75 to 67 in favor of Auburn. The previous meeting between these 2 teams, Auburn beat the brakes off of them, 101 to 61. Now, South Carolina, what they did in that game, though, was they actually had 2 guys who were pretty good from a fantasy perspective. Colin Murray Boyles was one of them. The freshman has turned into a star for this South Carolina team. In that Auburn game, he only needed 27 minutes to put up 31 fantasy points. And he's also put up 37 fantasy points or more in 4 straight. Basically, South Carolina just decided, hey, we're going to batter Arkansas down low. And Colin Murray Boyles went off. BJ Mack went off as well, 26 minutes, 33 fantasy points. So those 2 guys are clearly the guys that they want to run their offense through. I don't think they're going to have as much success doing it against Auburn, but those 2 are the 2 that are going to see pretty big usage rates, as well as Michi Johnson, who was the other guy who had a ton of success against Auburn earlier in the season. He played 27 minutes in that game and put up 35 fantasy points. He's another guy who has a ton of usage for South Carolina, was kind of a dud today against Arkansas because they did do so much through the interior of their offense, but he takes a ton of shots. He's got a really high usage rate. I don't mind Michi Johnson at all at 6,700 either. I will caution you, though, For me on this South Carolina team, I'm not playing more than one South Carolina guy in the lineup. I don't think it's very likely against this Auburn defense with how South Carolina can be kind of constipated offensively at times. I don't think it's likely that two or more of these guys hit value. After that, Taewon Cooper, we know he's a big-time assist guy. I like him in games where they're projected to score a lot of points, and they're only projected 67 in this game. That kind of tells you how I feel about him. Zachary Davis, though, is a guy that we need to take note of. He is now playing more minutes over Jacoby Wright and Miles Studi. And, that's kind of a lucrative role because you generally get a ton of three-point shots as the fifth guy in this South Carolina offense. So $5,200 for Zachary Davis, not a price I was hoping for. If he came in at about $4,400, I would be all over him. Now, on the Auburn side, in that first game, their two best players were Janai Broome and Jalen Williams. They both had over 20 points. And what's weird is that in a game where Auburn scored 101, no other player scored more than 11 for Auburn. But here's the problem with Auburn, and I'm going to be super interested to see how they play this game because this is their first game of their conference tournament. Bruce Pearl plays a huge rotation. They are one of the nation's leaders in bench minutes, and you just never really know who's going to get the minutes, who's going to get the usage, who's going to score the fancy points on a game-to-game basis. Janai Broome's going to because he's a walking double-double, and in a matchup against South Carolina where he's going to be going up against B.J. Mack, I like it. He was a victim of the blowout in the first game. He only played 22 minutes, only put up 29 fancy points, but if he plays a full minute load, which he doesn't always do, he's capable of going off for 50 fantasy points. Personally, I would rather pay up for Lendeborg than Janai Broome, but if Broome were to see 30-plus minutes, he would have as much upside as Lendeborg, or even as much upside as Zach Edey for that matter. Now, after him, the other guys that have kind of been trending in the right direction lately have been Chad Baker-Mazara and Denver Jones. They have been playing more minutes. They have been seeing more usage. They've kind of been the cream that has risen to the top of this Auburn rotation. If I were to play somebody other than Broome and Jalen Williams, because I think Jalen Williams is a pretty good play as well, it would probably be Baker-Mazara or Denver Jones or the freshman Aiden Holloway. He's the guy that I kind of just can't quit because I watched him in November and I thought, wow, this kid's good. He's going to be a star, and spoiler alert, he hasn't been a star. But he does have legitimate upside. He's put up 21 fantasy points or more in 2 of his last 5 games. If he plays enough minutes, takes enough shots, you never know what's going to happen. The last game of the slate is going to be St. John's taking on UConn, and this one is the highest total of the slate. KenPom has it projected to be 78-71 in favor of UConn. UConn swept the season series between these two teams 69-65 and 77-64. So the slow laterally St. John's Red Storm, according to Rick Pitino, have now started to condense their rotation, which is what we need if we want to have a lot of fantasy scoring come from this team. So Joel Soriano and Dennis Jenkins always played a lot of minutes, right? And in the game today against Seton Hall, they really played through Soriano. 35 fantasy points, really high usage rate, only took 7 shots, but the ball was in his hands a lot. He was able to get a double-double. He had 4 assists. I like what they did with their offense through Soriano today. Jenkins did not have as good of a day today. The usage rate was still high, but he only played 22 minutes for whatever reason. After those two have been the ones who've been the most consistent all season long. Ledlam played a ton of minutes today. And then really after that, it was a rotation of 2 of the 3 between Luis, Dingle, and Aline. Luis and Dingle are very high usage players who have a ton of upside. I probably wouldn't play them both together. I probably wouldn't. If I'm playing them, honestly, I probably would play only them on the St. John's side. But Luis put up 34 and 29 fantasy points in his last 2 games. Doesn't play the most minutes, ton of upside when he's out there. Jordan Dingle, we know he's an elite scorer, put up 18 fantasy points today in 32 minutes, took 13 shots though, which is what we like to see. So I definitely don't mind getting to either of those 2 guys for the upside that they contain. And then Naheem Aline, he won a championship last year with UConn. This is a guy who knows how to play in the postseason. This is a guy who knows what he's doing on the floor. Insert every other intangible comment that you can now, but $3,500 playing 21 minutes, put up 20 fantasy points today, put up 25 fantasy points against DePaul earlier in the month. He's definitely a solid option worth considering for St. John's, and he is a part of their postseason rotation. For UConn, Tristan Newton is been the guy in both of the meetings against St. John's this season. He put up 45 fantasy points in the second meeting and put up 35 fantasy points in the first meeting. And he really didn't shoot the ball that well in either of those 2 games, but he puts up so much peripheral stats that that's how he gets his fantasy points, right? And so today he was a little bit of a disappointment against Xavier. But the peripheral stats were still there. He just needs to give a little bit more of a scoring punch if we want him to really hit 4 and 5x value at his price tag of 8,800. Donovan Clingan, we know the story on him, right? He's a super high usage player. Just is he going to play enough minutes to put up a lot of fantasy points? Against St. John's, it's certainly a possibility. Here's the problem, though, when you look at UConn in their 2 meetings versus St. John's, they missed Clingan in one game and they missed Caravan in another game. So it's really hard to tell just how those two would perform when they're both healthy and on the same court. Cam Spencer's a guy that I like, though. I generally don't play a lot of Cam Spencer, but I'm coming around to it because he does have legitimate upside and he will fill up the stat sheet in a variety of ways. So if this game gets going up and down, which it should, this is a pace up spot for UConn, then he's going to have plenty of opportunities to put up fancy points as well. Definitely don't mind getting to Cam Spencer on this slate as well. All right, so let's go ahead and put a nice little bow on the early slate right there. Those were the 7 games for the early slate. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording right here, and we're going to take a look at what we got for the night slate as of right now. So as of this moment, we do kind of have the bones of the slate on DraftKings. We don't really have the salaries yet, but we do know what games are going to be on the slate. We don't know some of the teams in all the games though, because as I'm recording this at 11 Eastern time Thursday night, there's a lot of games that are still going on. So I'm going to kind of do my best to break down what we can kind of expect from this slate, just from a bird's eye view, not knowing the pricing. So the first game of the slate is going to be Ohio State, Illinois. This is one of the 4 games on the slate that's going to have a massive total. KenPom has it projected to be 80 to 75 in favor of Illinois. And look, can we talk enough about how good Ohio State's been in the last month of the season? Like, this team has completely turned around under interim coach Jake DeBoer. I am beginning to think more and more they should give him the full-time job. You could make an argument that when Chris Holtmann was fired, they were a little bit unlucky from their shooting splits. They were getting good quality looks and just not hitting them. And now they've kind of ran into some shooting regression. That's an argument that can be made. But the bottom line is this: when they're hitting shots, they look pretty good, right? And they've really been carried by Bruce Thornton and Jamison Battle in a game where they're projected to score 75 points against an Illinois team that can sometimes be disengaged defensively. You got to like Thornton and Battle again in that spot. And then on the Illinois side, we've talked about the conundrum all season long where, to me, it's either Shannon or Domask as their offensive leader. I think you can play Coleman Hawkins in this matchup as well. And then Quincy Guerrier looked better to me against Iowa than he had in probably the last month of the season. So definitely options on both sides you can get to. Another game that's going to be great to target is going to be Texas A&M taking on Kentucky. The first time these two teams played, it was 97-92 in overtime, which created just fantasy points galore, right? KenPom has this one tomorrow projected to be 81 to 78 in favor of Kentucky. Now, what made Texas A&M actually competitive in that game, because they shot the ball very poorly in that first game against Kentucky, was their offensive rebounding. They got a lot of them. And the good news is now in the SEC tournament, we've got a 1-game sample size of them beating Ole Miss to know they're condensing their rotation. It's going to be Taylor and Radford at the 2 guard spots. This we've known. Manny Obaseki on the wing, who I continued to play tonight, and he was a little bit of a disappointment, but the usage was there, the minutes there. I'm going to keep going back to him. And then Solomon Washington, and mainly Anderson Garcia at the 5, even though Garcia comes off the bench. So I definitely think that all 5 of those guys are going to be in play. I probably wouldn't play more than 2 or 3 of them, depending on how stacky you want to get. But everybody on this team rebounds. Everybody on this team can have ceiling performances. And if they're all going to play 30-plus minutes, then that's an easy pathway to a ceiling. And then with Kentucky, good luck figuring it all out. We know what Reed Shepherd does. We know what Rob Dillingham does. Are they going to play enough minutes when the game is on the line, when the season is on the line, to give good fantasy point performances? They did against Tennessee. Let's see if they'll be able to do it in the SEC tournament and beyond. Pitt taking on North Carolina. I don't know if we're going to get the supremely mispriced Blake Hinson and Armando Bacot on this slate. You could argue that Ish Leggett was a misprice heading into the Wake Forest game as well, because he looked really good in that game. In fact, Pitt looked really good in that game against Wake Forest. I have been banging the drum for Wake Forest all season long. And I think this is something we can get into on the Sunday night bracket show, that they're not going to make the NCAA tournament, even though I fully think that if they got there, they would be a team you wouldn't want to see. Pitt probably should get in the NCAA tournament at this point. And they're also going to be a team that you do not want to see. They're condensing their minutes as well. They're pretty much playing four guys, Leggett, Carrington, Lowe, and Henson, a ton of minutes. And then Diaz, Graham, and Federico are going to split minutes at the 5. I do think that you can target any of those guys for that reason. And on the North Carolina side, I think it's a supreme matchup for Armando Bacot. Efton Reed of Wake Forest looked really good against Pitt down low, and Armando Bacot and Efton Reed have a lot of characteristics with their build and general strength. So I do think that it's a great matchup for Armando Bacot. If he comes in at 6,800 again, he's going to be supremely high owned in this game. Texas Tech taking on Houston. This would be the cross-off game of the slate. Actually, the Providence game, whether or not they're playing Villanova or Marquette, if Providence ends up playing Villanova, that would be your cross-off game. But we've got Texas Tech taking on Houston. And if Texas Tech is still missing Warren Washington, I think that Juwan Roberts and Javier Francis of Houston become really interesting plays because Texas Tech has been battered down low without their starting center. So I do think that is a way that you can attack this game. But other than that, I think you can just totally pass. I love playing Pop Isaacs at Texas Tech because of his usage. But this is a spot where going up against Houston, on an 11-game slate, if I don't have to play somebody against Houston, I'm not going to. So I'm probably just going to pass on Texas Tech altogether. The next game that we know for sure is going to be Oregon taking on Arizona. I feel like we just watched this game. In fact, there was 186 points scored in the previous meeting between these two teams. KenPom has this game as the highest total of the slate right now at 157 points, 84-73 Arizona. So this is a game where you know it's going to get up and down. You know guys are going to score points. With Oregon, they're really turning it into a condensed usage with Dante and Cousinard. And so I really do think you can get to those two guys. I think it's a better matchup for Cousinard. He lit Arizona up for 36 the first time these two teams played. And on the Arizona side, there's definitely a few guys you can get to as well. Great game stacking option there. And then, unfortunately, we do not know what the remaining matchups are going to be at this moment in time as I'm recording. It looks like Boston College might beat Virginia, which would be really good for the NC State game. I think that would make the NC State game very targetable, especially depending on pricing. NC State has really condensed their rotation as well, with Jaden Taylor and DJ Horn getting a ton of usage, Michael O'Connell playing a ton of minutes. Mohamed Diarra continues to come in at like 0% owned because his price tag looks ridiculous for what he's done, but he keeps smashing at it. So I assume his price tag is going to keep going up and nobody's going to keep playing him. And then DJ Burns seeing a ton of usage on a modest amount of minutes, but he definitely is the type of guy that could give Boston College and Quentin Post trouble. So I do think that would be a really interesting matchup if that actually happens. And then Alabama is sitting there awaiting the Georgia-Florida winner. This one's really close right now. So I don't necessarily want to project that one, but whichever one of those two teams wins that game, there's going to be a ton of points scored because Alabama is in. Alabama is a team that loves to get up and down, and they don't really play a whole lot of defense. Florida's kind of the same way. Georgia is kind of the same way. So definitely going to be a great game environment there that you could target if we end up getting that one. For Alabama, it's going to be super interesting to see who they give minutes to. If Griffin and Wrightsell are both active, I think you could see a very short bench for Alabama where they really just play the starting five a ton of minutes. I don't know if it's going to happen for sure, but if it does, it's certainly going to be better for fantasy point purposes. All right, so that is as much as I will speculate here on the night slate. We've got Providence, Nebraska, and Iowa State also awaiting opponents as well. So I don't really want to jump the gun too much on pricing on what guys might be or what to expect from there. But if you want my full thoughts on the slate, you got the Fantasy Corner Discord, you got the article on Patreon. Hopefully that was enough to kind of give you guys a bird's eye view of what you can expect from each game and kind of just some names and ways that you can target each of those games. All right, so that does it for this Friday episode, y'all. Hopefully I was able to give you guys plenty of information that's going to allow you to make some money playing college basketball at DFS on Friday. If you like what you saw, please hit the like button on YouTube. Please rate and review the audio, and please hit the subscribe button to the channel so that way you can get notified when new episodes drop and you can be here for our live shows. Like I said, the plan is to go live tomorrow night, Saturday night, Sunday night, and then we're going to have the regular recorded shows for the bracket breakdown and the DFS shows next week as well. NCAA tournament week is one of my favorite weeks of the year. I cannot wait. So got a lot of content here, and I want you guys to get that too. So make sure you're subscribed and you can be here for all of that. I feel like there was one more thing I was going to say, but now I can't remember what it was. It's 11:13 at night, though. I'm exhausted. My 6-month-old daughter is currently sleeping, so she was able to give me enough time to get this recorded, so very thankful for that. Anyway, let's go ahead and end the episode there. So I'm going to go ahead and end the episode. Thank you guys for watching and listening. Best of luck to you on the Friday slate, and I will see you guys tomorrow night live to talk about the Saturday slate.